Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sela Social Studies. Today we're going to be talking about other civil rights movements, the violence that came along with some of them, as well as some of the reactions. So I want you to recall about what we've covered so far about what President Kennedy supported in the short time that he was in office. I briefly stated that Kennedy was a supporter of the civil rights movement, and he wanted protection for freedom riders in the South. So now we're going to discuss those riders and other civil rights movements and the reactions in more detail. In 1960, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in bus stations was illegal, and the agency in charge of desegregating those bus stations were not very quick in responding to the ruling. To challenge the laws and to force the change in the South, members of Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, planned the Freedom Rides. On May 4, 1961, black and white students packed a bus and left Washington, D.C. en route to New Orleans, Louisiana, to protest interstate segregation. Many students were arrested along the ride, and when the first bus arrived in rural Alabama, there was a large mob of angry white Southerners that intercepted the bus on its route. The mob surrounded and slashed the tires, incapacitating the bus. Bricks and stones were thrown through the windows, and axes and pipes were used to smash other windows and doors. A firebomb was thrown through the window, and the bus caught fire. The mob shook the bus and blocked the door, hoping to burn everyone alive who was left on the bus. As the students tried to escape, they were beaten with baseball bats, and those who were left were terrified that they would die. The only reason why the Freedom Riders were able to escape was because the state troopers arrived and forced that angry white mob away from the bus. These reactions resulted in CORE backing away from the Freedom Rides, but the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, decided to continue the rides until December 1961. The riders were often attacked and jailed along each journey. President Kennedy ordered the Interstate Commerce Commission to enforce the strict bans on segregation in interstate bus terminals, who would then begin desegregation. Kennedy did not place strict dates on when it was to be completed, so as tensions rose throughout the South, a gradual route to desegregation began to take shape, and the division between the races continued to grow. So now we'll turn our attention to Birmingham, Alabama, and the Human Rights March. In 1963, April of 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference joined a local campaign for human rights in Birmingham, Alabama, and organized marches. It began on April 3rd as a march along with sit-ins and peaceful nonviolent protests. King reinforced to the citizens the importance of nonviolence and civil disobedience. He did not want negative press on the protesters. He wanted it on the aggressors who would try to stop them. A few days into the protests, the city government obtained an injunction to stop the protesters. Martin Luther King took a day to review the injunction and decided to continue the protests even if it meant his arrest, and on April 12th, King was arrested for marching without a permit and was placed in solitary confinement. King requested to call his wife to inform her of his arrest and was denied. King's wife, Coretta, notified the Kennedy administration of her worries about King's safety, and word got through to allow King to call home. A week later, King was released from jail and continued to lead more marches into the city. On May 2, 1963, around 2,500 demonstrators and African American students attempted to march on Birmingham. Hundreds of students were arrested, and the local police force led by Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor was determined to put an end to the protests once and for all. The next day, as more protesters marched on Birmingham, Connor directed the fire department to focus their high-pressure fire hoses at point-blank range into the crowd of people. Connor ordered the police department to allow their canine units to sick their dogs on the peaceful protesters. Over the next few days, King's plan began to take shape as photographs of children being blasted with fire hoses, protesters are being attacked by huge police dogs, and people being clubbed by police began to be plastered in newspapers, and videos were shown on the news across the nation. The results of the widespread coverage in Birmingham led to American and international outrage about the treatment of African Americans in the South. Now let's talk about legislation for the civil rights movement. Under President Kennedy, the civil rights movement began to pick up a full head of steam. Since 1954 and the landmark Brown v. Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas Supreme Court case, public school had gradually begun to desegregate. And in 1962, under the protection of federal troops, James Meredith began to desegregate the University of Mississippi. Since the four young men in Greensboro began the sit-in movement at the Woolworth's lunch counter, racial discrimination fights spanned across the South, and desegregation was being forced in public places. In June of 1963, President Kennedy told the nation that he supported a civil rights bill that would ban segregation in all public places. In response to Kennedy's support for civil rights bill on August 28, 1963, over 250,000 people converged on the plaza in Washington, D.C. in what is known as the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Martin Luther King Jr. and A. Philip Randolph organized the event to show support for the civil rights bill. It was here where whites and blacks sang, "We shall overcome," and over 250,000 people listened intently as King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. King stated to the world, "So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at a table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right down in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and little white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. As more successes took place, there were just as many setbacks in the fight for human rights. We discussed what happened with the Freedom Riders in Birmingham. NAACP leader Medgar Evers was murdered outside of his home. KKK membership in the South skyrocketed. Churches were bombed, killing 4 children, and many were murdered in Freedom Summer, the attempt to register African American voters in the South. Many believe that when Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963, that King's dream may have died with him. But remember what I said in our last section. Kennedy's vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, took the helm and continued Kennedy's fight for civil rights and against poverty. On July 2, 1964, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act banned segregation in public places and outlawed discrimination in the workplace on the basis of color, gender, religion, or national origin. What did this mean for African Americans? Now they cannot be overlooked for a job because of their race, and segregation in all public places is now illegal. President Johnson also focused his attention to voting rights for African Americans. We covered in our class previously what the Southern reaction to Reconstruction was and how Southern white Democrats attacked black voters using the literacy test, poll tax, or grandfather clause to disenfranchise African American voters in the South. And in August of 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. This act gave the federal government new powers to protect the voting rights of African Americans and rid the South of the old voting laws like the literacy test and grandfather clause. The poll tax was eradicated by the passing of the 24th Amendment. Within 3 years of the Voting Rights Act passing, more than half of all qualified African Americans in the South registered to vote. And while this was impressive, African Americans to this day are still disenfranchised in many southern states. So we're going to have some new leadership amongst the civil rights activists. Through the later half of the 1960s, African Americans were beginning to feel tired of the peaceful, nonviolent protests of King. They were tired of constantly being peaceful and in return being beaten, jailed, or even killed, and looking across the South and seeing very little change. In 1966, James Meredith attempted to march peacefully from Tennessee to Mississippi when he was ambushed and shot. Leaders such as King and the emerging leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Stokely Carmichael, rushed to Meredith as he lay dying in the hospital. Carmichael believed that the March to Mississippi needed to continue to show dedication against segregation. As Carmichael marched south, he had noticed that not much has changed, even though President Johnson had passed many legislative acts that was supposed to end the segregation and discrimination. One day while giving a speech, Carmichael stated to the small crowd, "What we need is black power." And from that moment, the Black Power movement was born. Carmichael would start yelling "Black Power," and many of the crowd would shout back the same. The Black Power movement became a strong force that called for African American independence. King denounced Carmichael and the Black Power movement because they were not followers of the peaceful and civil disobedient protests. They were forceful. Carmichael believed that African Americans should reject integration and instead focus on strengthening the black communities without the help of white people, and that blacks should feel a sense of racial pride and self-respect. The Black Power movement would spread throughout the African American community quickly because it gave a sense of power and pride to be black in America, where phrases like "black is beautiful" and "say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud" rang throughout the streets. Later, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale would form the Black Panther Party. Sick of being harassed by police, the Panther Party would follow cops around with state statute books, and at every car stop or attempted arrest, a member of the Panthers would step out and over a loudspeaker shout the rights and laws to the African Americans who were getting harassed. They would carry open arms, meaning that they would show their guns in public, and attempt to protect African Americans from police brutality. This forceful group would exchange gunfire in the streets across America, which alarmed many Southern whites. Peaceful protests were becoming a thing of the past, and civil disobedience and the civil rights movement as a whole suffered a huge loss when on April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was gunned down by assassin James Earl Ray outside the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. The world was shocked, but this gave more ammunition to men like Newton and Seale, believing that they needed to fight fire with fire. The last major civil rights leader and advocate who inspired the Black Power movement that we'll discuss in this section is Malcolm Little, otherwise known as Malcolm X. After Malcolm was arrested and thrown in jail, he began to educate himself. He had converted to Islam and began to read the Quran, worship Allah and their God, and accept Muhammad as his chief prophet. A religious group that believed that Islam was a closer religion to the slave than Christianity, named the Nation of Islam, preached black pride and black nationalism, took notice to Malcolm X. After the leader of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, spoke with Malcolm X, Muhammad believed that Malcolm would make a great spokesperson for the group. Malcolm X became a leader of the Nation of Islam. He would preach that white people should not be trusted and that African Americans should be proud of their heritage and that black Americans should establish a separate state in which they could rely on their own race to solve the problems of society. Malcolm X combined ideas about African American independence with the teachings of Islam to paint his picture of African Americans in the United States. He believed that violence was justified in self-defense and that African Americans had the right to defend themselves, incorporating violence and using any means necessary. Malcolm X rose in prominence and power, and many of the Nation of Islam feared that X would replace Muhammad as its leader. Malcolm X would leave the nation and travel his own route to self-righteousness and lead his followers against white America. Unfortunately, the Black Power movement struck a huge blow when on February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X was gunned down while giving a speech by 3 members of the Nation of Islam. Black Power would survive through the legacy of Malcolm X. All right, guys, we'll see you next time on Selah Social Studies.